John. John. Are we live?
Are we live? Are we alive? Are we live?
The weekend after Halloween, we survived.
Did survive, yeah. I'm actually happy because you forgot that you wanted me to wear my costume, and I was like, I bet
you. No.
Yeah, I sent Matt a picture on Friday of being like, oh, look what I'm dressed up as, and we did the costume from the movie Dodgeball, Average Joe's. So that was kind of funny. Had the ball and everything like that. He's like, you gotta wear that when we're on Monday morning. I'm like, yeah, sure. And then I just like roll in, and I'm like, yeah. So let's go. Let's get ready to go. But thankfully, it was because Matt's clearly having some technical difficulties today. So
it's part of the theme. My camera got haunted. The battery died. We were doing some ghostly tours, I guess, for Halloween. But with that note, we're going to do a Blair Witch style on Matt's part, and John's going to try to figure out where I am.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking for that GPS location delivered on time.
With that, we're going to start like we always do with our morning coffee for John to wake him up. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wake Up and Deliver, Season 2, Episode 42. And when you stop treating your current opportunity as a stepping stone to something else and start treating it as the only thing that matters, opportunity finds you, is the quote of the day right now.
That's a little different flavor than a lot of the ones you've been blessing us with lately.
I like to point out John's on a roll today.
I am. I'm rolling already. Good weekend. Yeah, I don't know. I like that. I probably, the closest thing that I probably would include from my personal experiences that I always take for myself and share with people I work with, teams, whatever, that no matter where you're at, like take everything you can from it in terms of like your growth, your learning, understanding like how you can sort of enrich yourself from it. So, I guess staying focused on your present and current thing more so than always looking elsewhere. So I don't 100% hate it. You know what I mean?
That's all that matters, John. That's all that matters. I am holding my phone, so if I look awkward, it's because I am awkward. I'll do like one of those 360.
I'm just waiting till we get to the end of the show and you're like shaking and like everyone's gonna wonder. Yeah, exactly.
Because the phone's too heavy. You got to hold this little phone all the time. But when you're scrolling through stuff, it doesn't seem that heavy. But when you're recording, it's the weight. The weight of the internet is on my hand.
Oh, the weight of the world. There you go.
On that, let's get started before my camera flashes me out of this this phased existence. What do we had a great show last week. Maybe we can recap a little bit about that.
We did. Yeah, that was. Yeah, so Dan was on, Dan, CEO of Front Door Collective, and really talked about their new partnership with Target. But we really got into a lot of stuff, obviously, all last mile and going from some more technical points to just some broader overall kind of quality and experience points for retailers to be thinking about. It was super cool. He was very open and forthcoming with everything. He didn't actually reject any of our questions, which was nice because we obviously said to him as we started, like, if there's something you don't want to talk about, that's cool. We get your business and whatever. But I think everything we brought up, he chimed in on. I don't think he put anything to a no column.
No, I think he did quite well. I think it was a nice experience. It was a different take on guests that we've had before. Mm-hmm. And I think it was quite a different experience. So hopefully we get more people interested in it, and we have more people that want to volunteer, or we start searching more to join us every Monday morning for Wake Up and Deliver.
Yeah, definitely. So do you have anything that sort of is getting your spidey senses going to start the week, or no?
Oh, there's so much going on from everything and anything that is happening in the world right now. I don't even know where to begin. in all honesty. But a lot of trade deals last week happened, or speaking of trade deals between not only United States and partners in Asian community, but also for Canada. Canada signed a whole bunch of trade deals, or intent for trade deals, which is going to be interesting as countries are reshifting their supply chains. What is the effect going to be on North American trade? As it was predominantly, 80% of our trade used to go down south, but now as we focus on ports and whatnot, how is that going to change the dynamic of our supply chain, which I want to, obviously be happy to be part of, but curious to how that kind of develops.
Well, yeah, especially too, and I mean, since we'll stick with the Canadian theme for a second, Canada obviously making a strong push now to put themselves as a reliable exporter of energy, right? So there's a lot of focus on that. And not just obviously into the US, right? Obviously, energy exports, if you want to think about that, into the US, obviously a big part of what we've been doing. But now obviously looking to do things with other countries to different levels of activity. So that's interesting. I think what was also very interesting was the fact that both Canada and the US, even though we don't seem to be talking, obviously they didn't appreciate some stuff that seemed to come up from the Ontario government last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was. But both parties kind of announcing some stronger relationships with China. And I saw something on, I don't know, it must have been Saturday morning, I'm thinking, from Aaron Rubin, right? From Shapiro. And he kind of made this like really tongue-in-cheek comment that, turns out to be true, where he's basically like saying, hey, everybody was told to get your manufacturing out of China. We got to get out of China. People left China, only to find out that it was the best move to go back to China or to stay in China in the first place, the way things are shaking out, right? So, and that stemmed from a little bit of this China rolling back or saying they won't implement some of these rare earth element type restrictions that they had announced. And then the US government saying that they're also going to ease some tariff pressure on them and potentially even remove certain types of tariffs that have been on things as far back as 2022 if they start seeing these soybean purchases that China had typically been making that had all but stopped in 2025.
Well, I heard the interesting thing was that they rolled it back to pre-January 7th tariffs is what the win is. So it's back to where we began, which was a bad deal before.
All without though the e-com piece, right? Which is all of the sort of like duty free, like de minimis type shipments that were all coming in on the more macro level. Yeah, like things are kind of resettling, I guess, if you want to say that, after I don't know a year of wild activity. And it's hard to say what else potentially is benefiting, one country versus the other or whoever, because for whatever is posted, I don't think all of the details are actually just put out there, in black and white.
No, the one thing I'd like to see though is as we diversify our supply chains, is seeing more activity from Canada to open it up to different supply chains to bring in, specifically automotive. The big three's kind of taking away a lot of manufacturing from Canada. I'd like to see the Renault, the Peugeots, and all those kind of companies come back into Canada where they used to be, and have the car manufacturers come back into North America, where it has been kind of shunned for the last 30, 40 years because it wasn't profitable, but might now be a little bit more of idea. And even some of these Chinese electric cars will help reduce the reliance on the big three if they don't want to be here within Canada as well, which I think would be an interesting way to diversify the economy that way, and then put pressure back out there that, hey, maybe we want to stay as good trading partners within North American context, which I think ideally is the way we want to go, right?
Yeah, well, so that's kind of interesting though. So you're right. Like also Ontario, which is, probably our biggest province of activity, obviously, is where all of the car manufacturing for the most part was located. And obviously with all of these changes has been really upset by the Canada-US relations. But funny enough, even our government at the provincial level is very uncomfortable with the idea of these sort of Chinese EVs, especially BYD. And funny enough, Britton Ladd actually posted something on Sunday afternoon. I think it was Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, where he was essentially like calling out like the CEO of Ford, straight up saying he's lying about the fact that, the only reason why he's presenting the type of case he is about Ford and what, the government should be doing versus shouldn't be doing when it comes to some of these sort of like Chinese EVs is just because of the fact that they're so far behind in terms of technology. And he was even talking about a Huawei, I think it was, or Xiaomi, one of the two, I forget which one it was, that they even came out with this SUV that's apparently killer. Like, I think it's called an S07 or something like that.
Right.
And just saying that like these big three or like, the sort of more traditional manufacturers are like just way out of step. And I think to a certain degree, that's a fair comment, even when you look at Tesla, because Tesla makes the design of a lot of these vehicles, like especially on the interior, really feel sluggish.
Sluggish?
Well, in the sense that they haven't really done much. So like it's just been, very small and incremental changes. They haven't been very bold with dramatically shifting anything. Like example, my girlfriend's looking at a new car, and you're sitting in some of these new cars from some of these big manufacturers, and I swear to God, like it's some of it looks like the same stuff that was in a similar vehicle, 10 years ago.
This is your SU7.
Okay, I hadn't looked it up other than kind of the brief reference to it and stuff like that. So look at this thing. This is what I'm talking about with like design, right? Like just like a different vibe and a different feel the second that you. Oh, okay, so it is Xiaomi. So once you once you are into these things, just compare that to like, I don't know, pick any like GM vehicle, pick a Ford vehicle for the most part. They're not that modern feeling on the inside. Oh, we lost your audio now. You muted yourself. The terrible technical challenges continue. Look at this. So, but the interesting thing is with these things is when you think about your supply chain and you think about how all of these interconnected parts of your economy, like what's going to happen when like, these major industries start taking issues, but not so much just them, but like all of the sort of secondary and supplier type industries that also move product in and are part of this sort of supply chain and part of this value chain. What happens when that dramatically shifts, potentially to another country or potentially to a company that's going to do something very different? It really upsets a lot of what is happening in the market about what, about like
I'm back.
what
I'm back.
Oh, I saw your mic drop off or come like, yeah, the mute button. But, my point with that was just like, the impact to overall supply chains, when you think then of like capacity, when you think of like lanes, when you think of movements, like, I don't think sometimes people realize like that there's always like a broader implication to these big business changes because of the fact that like in the same way that when domestic air shipments like sort of dried up a lot for UPS and FedEx, these guys still had the planes. So they didn't just like park them. They're like, oh, well, there's a lot of stuff still happening in Europe and Asia. And they just actually redeployed a bunch of planes. So they're still using their assets and they still are able to make these moves. But if you think about it in a North American context or a US context or whatever, there's less capacity for those types of moves than there was in the past.
Yeah, I mean that globalization that we went through in the 90s and early 2000s and in the 2010s to really integrate all these supply chains across the world really came under attack, obviously with COVID and how fragile they are. And one of the big things was the microchips for car manufacturers and how much they relied on it. And we're seeing that again in Europe right now with the chip manufacturer that was owned by the Chinese, and then the Dutch basically nationalized the one company, and now they're having a shortage of that supply chain in North America because the Americans said, hey, this is part of the list that you cannot be trading with. And so we see the fragility of this manufacturing that we have that's globalized in the sense where you got to be really able to have backups. And then one of the great examples of this that I read was Nokia and Ericsson back in the early 90s and 2000s had a very similar problem. And Nokia diversified their supply chain and found backups and redundancies to everything they did in case something came under threat. And Ericsson did not. So when a chip manufacturer did kind of stop or had an issue, Nokia was able to continue on with their backup, and they were able to continue supplying the world with phones, and that's how they became very popular. And Ericsson at the time was much a rival, and then they dropped off. And you see that a lot with Apple and Intel and all these other diversifications of their supply chain, of being able to provide other chips or other manufacturing methods not to lose their position in something. And we can relate this back into the supply chain where in transportation, like if you're always providing the one service to your customer, and you're constantly providing that one service, and that customer changes or no longer is there, and you got nothing else to fall back on, you got to have those redundancies of something else to be able to take that spot, where you should never have a whole process in one basket.
So, like, I definitely agree with you. And I think, though, where the challenge is for a lot of companies or for a lot of people is that people kind of get anchored to the idea, and they don't kind of tie enough of it to the business strategy. And this, you see this a lot for, like, obviously people on the platform like LinkedIn or whatever, talking about like things like carrier diversification or having all of these warehouses, whatever. It's like diversification or risk mitigation is extremely important when you're in supply chain, but it's not about the idea without strategy. Because the thing is, to your point, of course, having having a backup, having a secondary supplier is important, but you also can't have like 5 of them lined up and think that the second that one drops off, you'll all of a sudden get to move to the top of the queue. Because the reality is, every supplier, whether they're in manufacturing, whether they're in service or whatever, will take care of their core customers first before they would just take on someone that is being opportunistic. Absolutely. You know what I mean? So that's where I think that people miss they anchor to the idea because it feels like, well, I'm doing the right thing. But it's like, but you still have to be important to everybody. Like, you still have to matter to everybody.
And I think that's a great segue, because I think we're seeing a lot of that in the transportation aspect of logistics right now, where you have a lot of customers who have been having a lot of capacity go out, and when they don't need to find others because there's so much capacity. As that capacity is starting to get constrained, especially on the U.S. side, they don't have those backups now, and they're going, well, where's all the capacities? Because you were ignoring all these phone calls for the last 6 months, 9 months to a year. You weren't diversifying your supply chain. You only had maybe 1 or 2 suppliers, but those guys aren't coming through. You should always have at least 5 or 6, and there should be a mixed bag. I forget who, I think it's actually our Eric Williams who said it, and he does a lot of good controversial comments, but he said you should always have a mixed bag of assets and non-assets. If you have completely assets in your book, it's not good either. And if you have completely non-assets in your book, it's not good. You should always have a mixed bag. And for that reason is because you're constantly bringing in new abilities to serve you when one person drops the ball, and always having to be engaged in that conversation. It can't be just during that RFQ season. And I think that's a lot of the frustrating people that often do is they talk to their suppliers once a year, put in your rates, and off you go. And they don't understand the mobility of their ability to hold on to that business. And we've had conversations with a lot of customers recently where they realized they had no redundancies in their supply chain. They're going, hey, we're looking for these redundancies because we realize there's a gap if this guy has a problem. And it might be something as simple as a succession plan, in which a lot of assets are having challenges with their succession plans. There's nobody to take on that mantle afterward. The company just sells to a bigger company, and you don't want to be part of that bigger company's supply chain, and you become vulnerable in your supply chain. I know I've kind of unpacked a lot there for you, John, to take on.
No, but I agree. I mean, I think that I do think, like I said, I think at the end of the day, it's like, how well do you align that activity with like the strategy of your business, with like where you're going? Because, the thing is, like, the complicated thing is that, like, in the same way, it's like, supply and demand. Well, there's that tie in between like activity, revenue, and profitability, right? So at some point you have to have enough revenue that's ideally generating a meaningful level of like contribution for whoever you're working with. It has to be something that works for you. And all of those, so you can't just piecemeal out and do, I'm just going to give you if I have let's just say, for example, I do 25,000 moves a year. Okay, well, I can't just give you 1,000 and think that like, I'm going to be important to you. You know what I mean? But you also may not want to just split them up equally. Like there is really a lot of thought that has to go into the way that you diversify and the way that you mitigate risk. And to your point, the way that you mitigate risk, but that also allows you to potentially shift so that, that person that might have been a type of backup support can now all of a sudden be someone that can grow with you or grow with you in a way that, complements your business.
So maybe a question for someone who comes from that world is, especially if you're a CPG and you're smaller and you're breaking down into a space and you have overnight success, what would you suggest someone like that? How should they look at their suppliers, and how should they look for their suppliers in an economy that has overcapacity currently? But in the trend, if you read between the lines, the capacity is shrinking, and it could be shrinking very quickly. How do you get in there and get someone to be the right partner with you if you don't know who the right partners are out there?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that it's obviously super important that, like, if you're an organization that is got that physical component to your business, that you do have people that you're bringing in, whether it's external hires, whether it's consultants or whatever, that actually have a different focus on your business and that are like working for your interests and stuff like that, and really can push and understand. Like you and I have talked about this like a ton on the show about, how do you know a carrier is good? What are the types of things you can do? How do you kind of separate like the quality from the nonsense? And that to me just comes kind of back down to like, are you actually prioritizing or investing in those type of supply chain activities, or, if it's specifically logistics or whatever it may be tied to your operations? I think that that's super important. Because that way, when you're, to answer your question specifically, if you're a small CPG company and you're just growing, I honestly, most of the time, I think that you probably shouldn't over diversify, right? You're in a period of growth. You need to kind of stabilize. You need to make sure that you understand your business. And I honestly don't think most of the time those types of companies in those situations have the bandwidth to then actually be able to manage multiple different partners effectively and test and also be able to feel comfortable starting and stopping activity. So I think you have to get to a certain level of maturity before you can then also start working with, deeper levels of like risk mitigation. Because if not, you can end up really shooting yourself in the foot where you over diversify too quickly, trying to mitigate your risk, and you have nothing but service challenges and mispromises all over the place, which unfortunately will probably kill you faster than anything else. The key there, of course, though, is to make sure that you do spend the right amount of time when you are picking at least that first, 1, 2, or 3 partners, because the you need to have a foundation to build anything on. And that's the most important thing, is like, who are the people you can really rely on, and how sure are you of that?
Well, not only that, I think it also comes how that transparency is between them and how well you can rely on them. And often I find that beginning CPGs, or even customers that have, call it, less than $1 million worth of transportation spend, they don't know who the good, bad, and the ugly are, because there's not a lot of information out there to validate who the good, bad, and the ugly are, right? So the first thing they'll do is they'll Google it or ChatGPT it, and those who pay the most for their SEO or their ability to surface best seem like the best choice. And there's not much analytics on who is better than the next person, because it's very hard and difficult. And a lot of it comes down to, in my opinion now at that point, is that relationship, is how well do you click with the leadership and the foundational values of the person that you're dealing with, because you can't really get into the nitty gritty of those KPIs, because it's kind of hard to understand that. Because I don't know, I've been part of a few assets, I've been part of a few non-assets, and I can tell you wholeheartedly, all of them will tell you they're 99% on time.
Everybody tells you they're the best. Like there's not a transportation or logistics provider out there that like their sales pitch. And actually, if you guys are doing this out there, like, please stop, because if you're speaking to me or to anyone else as a customer, like when I was looking after this stuff, and in the first like 5 minutes, the only thing you can say is you're the best. There's nothing you're offering then.
And that's the point, right? So I think that's why it gets driven down by that relationship. So maybe it's like, it's going on a first date. You got to get past the surface level of information and get down to the nitty gritty of what the person is like, who's dealing with your freight, if they will truly care, or you just become part of their Rolodex of things. You might not be their, to your point, John, maybe not become the most important part of their fit, of their volume, but if you're a strategic fit for them, they'll have far more greater respect for your freight than someone who just sees you as a number at the end of the year. They only come to see you once a year, right?
Well, here's another interesting thing, and this is going to sound like a ringing endorsement for Matt, but I think that it's I think it's an important thing to consider, is that no matter who it is, Monarch Connect, there you go. No matter who it is, everyone has, and I actually give credit for this term because I like it a lot, but to Chris Jarvis, and he talked about mechanical capacity, which I think is something super important for people to separate from the way people will use capacity in other regards. But everybody has a mechanical capacity when they have their assets, right? So if you're a smaller business, you just have to realize that the likelihood that you have enough actual movement and you're generating enough revenue to be very important to like larger asset-based carriers, because to your point, Matt, most people who Google, they'll find the biggest companies, you know what I mean? So whatever, that you're going to be important enough to them, that's, in my opinion, very unlikely. But when you can leverage someone, like Monarch, or there's obviously others out there that, are working with tons of different partners. Now, all of a sudden it becomes like, hey, your freight becomes an interesting opportunity because of the fact that people are always looking for other ways to supplement, complement, or leverage moves that have already happened or are already happening to different levels of volume. And I think that that's something super interesting that most people overlook, because I do think there's a lot of value in asset. For the majority of my career, heavily leveraged into asset-based carriers for whatever, different reasons and whatever. But I can tell you that I don't think that works as well when you're not a, multi-billion dollar business per se, or $100 million, multi-$100 million business. I think that you are missing the boat when you're not looking at some different options for sure.
And I'll give you a real world example before we hit our mark and being conscious of everybody's time. Because last week we just
you're being conscious of your arm. That's what you're being conscious of.
It is when we first started over a year ago now, when we got one of our first RFPs, RFQs, we went after everything. We kind of like threw the spaghetti at the wall to see what stuck, and we're like, we won a few lanes. We were excited, but they weren't lanes that we were a niche in. So we did them right, but it was a struggle, and it was very time consuming, and it was not part of the way that we wanted to operate. And as the year went on, we better our performance by narrowing in on what we were good at and the areas that we were better at. And what I mean by that is every broker they have specific areas that they're very excellent at dealing at in commodities. You come to me, and I'm going to be very honest. You're going to be like, hey, Matt, I got flatbed. I need to take up to Yellowknife. Can you help me out? I'm going to say, yeah, but John, I'm not the best at this. I can help you. I can probably get you in contact with someone that is, or I can try my best, but this is not I can't say yes in 30 seconds. You tell me, hey, Matt, I got loads coming out of, Miami, Florida, coming back to Toronto. Can you help me? Yes, I sure can. As long as they're reefer, as long as they're dry van, I can help you because I have the capacity, and I know I have capacity there every single day. There's other lanes that, the sphere into that area where you might know a little bit more, and you'll be like, yes, I can do it, but I need to have these resources in place to be able to do it. And that's when someone's being honest with you. If someone gives you a yes answer right away for whatever reason, always dig deeper and find out, why are you so good into this area? Why can you say yes here? Because even carriers go, hey, Matt, you got California freight? I go, nope, I don't do California. They're like, why? And it seems to be, I'm like, it's great for other people. I just, too many peaks and valleys for myself. I'd rather avoid California, come back into Canada for whatever reason until I'm ready or until I have a very specific need for that. And then I'll say the same thing to to customers. If you really want me to do it, I'll do it, but it's not my strongest suit. And I'll do it because you're asking me to do it. But I'm letting you know this is not my area, sphere of influence, as I would put it.
Which for most people out there, if you've never been on the buy side of that conversation almost never happens. So super important when it does.
But on that note, John, it is at that time, and I'll leave you with the final thoughts besides my camera angle.
Well, no, my final thought, something super interesting that maybe we'll get into next week, but some initial reports coming out as we're rolling right into the holiday season now that tariffs in the US might cost consumers an extra $40 billion this year. Now, if they break it down to the most minor level of it, I think it's like $132 more a person, something like that, which doesn't seem like a big deal. But at the same time, like you can't think that everything is going to sell the same ways it did before if at the net it comes out to $40 billion more.
Yeah, $42 billion more. I just did the math.
Yeah.
Spot on. It's not chump change. It's a lot of people don't have that.
Yeah.
Well, especially
a few billion lying around. I mean, I don't know.
Especially with when there's a lot of people relying on government funding, not that being available, that it actually weighs more on the upper tier than it does on the lower tier. But great segue out on that.
So leave everyone thinking about that until next week. Maybe drop your questions about any of those kind of comments. We'll get into it next week.
On that note, thanks everybody for joining. Come join us next week, same time, same channel. Potentially back to the old camera and an old view. I might have to get a new battery, but she's charging right now, so hopefully she gets charged up for next week. She needed a break this week.
Oh my God.
On that note, bye everybody.